Welcome back, everyone, to the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Ryan Mckern. And thank you for joining me once again in the darkness to explore an American folklore legend, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, Irving, Washington, and the New York City town that embraces the Halloween spirit of the very tale that birthed. Sit back and dwell in darkness, my friends. And thank you again for joining me in the Wicked Webs We Weave. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This classic short story is considered an example of early American folklore. Tales of headless horsemen have been around since the Middle Ages. The legend of Sleepy Hollow resurfaces every year around Halloween. Washington Irving's 1820 tale of a headless horseman who terrorizes a real-life village of Sleepy Hollow is considered one of America's first ghost stories, and one of its scariest. But Irving didn't invent the idea of headless rider. Tales of headless horsemen can be traced to the Middle Ages, including stories from the brothers of Grimm and the Dutch and Irish legend of De Wolahan, or Gan Sien, a grim reaper-like rider who carries his head. Elizabeth Bradley, a historian of the historic Hudson Valley, says the likely source for Irving's horsemen can be found in Sir Walter Scott's 1796 The Chase, which is translation to the German poem The Wild Huntsman by Gottfried Bourgeois, and likely based on Norse mythology. Irving had just met some friends in Scott in 1817, so it's likely he was influenced by his new mentor's work, she says. The poem is about a wicked hunter was doomed to be hunted forever by the devil and the dogs of hell as punished for his crimes, according to the New York Historical Society. Others believe Irving was inspired by an actual Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball during the Battle of White Plains in 1776. Irving's story takes place in the New York village of Sleepy Hollow in Westchester County. In it, Langley Newcomer and schoolmaster Ichabod Crane courts Katrina Van Tassel, a young heiress who is also being pursued by the Dutchman Brom Bones after being rebuffed by Katrina at a party at the Van Tassel Forum, where ghost stories are shared. Ichabod is chased by a headless horseman who may or may not be his rival, who hurls a pumpkin at the man, throwing Ichabod from his horse. The schoolmaster vanishes. Irving may have been drawn inspiration for his story while a teenager in Tarrytown region. He moved to the area in 1798 to flee a yellow fever outbreak in New York. According to the New York Historical Society, would have been introduced to local ghost stories and lore at an impressionable age, Bradley says. He cleverly weaves together factual locations, the old Dutch church and churchyard, Major Andre's tree, some actual names including Von Tassel and Ichabod Crane, and a little bit of Revolutionary War history, pure imagination and fantasy. Bradley says it is a melting pot of a story, and thus totally American. Franz Potter, a professor at National University who specializes in Gothic studies, says the Headless Horseman, as a supernatural entity, represents a past that never dies, but always haunts the living. The Headless Horseman supposedly seeks revenge and a head, which he thinks was unfairly taken from him, Potter says. This injustice demands that he continually search for a substitute. The horseman, like the past, still seeks answers, still seeks retribution, and can't rest We are haunted by the past which stalks us, so that we never forget it. As folklore mixing with the history when it comes to the character of Ichabod Crane, the New York Times reports an actual Colonel Ichabod B. Crane was a contemporary of Irving, who was enlisted in the Marines in 1809, serving 45 years, but there's no evidence that the two ever met, according to the newspaper. America's first ghost story, Bradley says, has endured because of its accommodation and changing American imagination. It inspires people because it reminds them that there are still some American mysteries, some half-truths that may never be fully known. And that's the whole point, she says. The legend lends itself to an interpretation, fascinate and terrify us in the best positive way. Literary giants like Irving's tale and Edgar Allan Poe resonate to this very day. And now in the second part of this podcast, I would like to focus on some of the main haunts these attractions invoke, both the spiritual and haunting and darkness within. Step inside and beyond the works of Washington's fabled tale. And in Halloween, Sleepy Hollow is a visit to the haunts of the Headless Horseman. Several major landmarks from the story and the entire route of Ichabod Crane's fight from the Horseman are easily identifiable. The location of the Van Tassel homestead, the spots where the British spy John Andre was captured, the mill pond at Phillipsburg Manor, the Old Dutch Church, Raven Rock, and the secluded valley Washington Irving called Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane's schoolhouse at the bridge upon which he lost his race with the Headless Horseman have been lost to the ravages of time. The Van Tassel homestead. Schoolmaster Ichabod Crane began his famous flight from the Headless Horseman at the home of the Van Tassel family. Local tradition attaches the flirty Katrina to the Elizabeth Von Tassel house, which was converted to a tavern before the Revolutionary War by Matt family historian Edgar Matthew Bacon. In his 1898 book, Chronicles of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, it notes that Irving was a frequent visitor at the old house, especially during the time that his sister boarded there with the Matt family. In their 1975 history of the Tarrytowns, Jeff Canning and Wally Baxton agree, adding that the house was once part of a 165-acre farm owned by John Van Tassel. The former Elizabeth Van Tassel house was located at what is now the northeast corner of Hamilton Place and North Broadway in Tarrytown. The landmark condominium building presently on the site was formerly the Frank R. Pearson School, circa 1897, which itself was formerly the Washington Irving High School until the 1920s, and the school district built a new Washington Irving High School at the corner of Franklin Street and South Broadway in Tarrytown. There is a bronze marker on the southwest corner of the landmark noting that it occupies the site of the former Matt Tavern. Landmark condominium, 18 North Broadway, 1 block north of Main Street, Tarrytown, New York, 10591. Patriots Park and the Andre Captor Monument. The marsh area where Ichabod Crane first encountered the Headless Horseman has long since been drained, but its stream still flows through a park half in the village of Tarrytown and half in the village of Sleepy Hollow. Tarrytown owns and administers the whole park, even the section in Sleepy Hollow. A monument marks the spot where, on September 23, 1780, 3 local militiamen captured British spy John Andre, exposing American General Benedict Arnold's treasonous plan to turn over the fortifications at West Point to the British. Since Arnold's plan also involved handing over George Washington, the three locals may have averted a very different ending to the American Revolution. In the legend, this spot is haunted by the ghost of the ill-fated Andre. The spy was hanged at Tappan, New York, across the Hudson River, and is where the Headless Horseman begins trailing Ichabod. The park and monument are located the west side of Route 9, Broadway, at the border between Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. About 200 yards across from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thick wooded glen known by the name of Willie's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. It was this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under a covert of these chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. In the dark shadow of the grove on the margin of the brook, Ichabod beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathering up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to stirring upon the traveler. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Phillipsburg Manor's house and mill and restorations of the 17th century Dutch manor. Beside those mill pond, Ichabod Crane strolled with the local girls. Phillipsburg Manor and house and mill are restorations of the 17th century Dutch manor. Beside those mill pond, Ichabod Crane strolled through with the locals. Frederick Philip Peace, builder of the mill and manor house, also constructed the old Dutch church of Sleepy Hollow. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels, gazing in the churchyard or sauntering with a whole bevy along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sleepishly and sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance in the dress. The statue of the Headless Horseman in hot pursuit of Ichabod Crane is located just a few feet from the bridge where the schoolmaster thought he would find safety. The old Dutch church. Ichabod Crane's flight from the Headless Horseman ends at the bridge leading into the yard of the old Dutch church. The 2-acre burying ground around the church is the purported final resting of local citizen, who likely inspired Irving's character of Katrina Van Tassel, Brombones, and others in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and also of the horseman himself. The church and churchyard are adjacent to, but not affiliated with, the 90-acre Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the specter, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle in nightly quest for his head, and that the rushing speed in which he sometimes passes along Hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated, and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Raven Rock is nestled in a far corner of Rockefeller State Park Preserve. It is a rock configuration known as the Raven Rock. Local historians Jeff Canning and Wally Buxton describe 3 ghostly associations with this spot in their book History of the Tarrytowns. The rock and one of its legendary ghosts make an appearance in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's and, as usual, were doing out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The Sleepy Hollow of legend is the valley of the Pocantico River, small stream that flows into the Hudson River. The valley and stream are remarkably accessible and sleepy to this day. Flowing through Rockefeller State Park, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, in the village of Sleepy Hollow is Douglas Park. Roaming the endless carriage roads of the state park or wandering among the monuments of the cemetery It's easy to conjure an image of Ichabod Crane, making his way to his schoolhouse in the gathering gloom of some overcast autumn afternoon. You might just hear hoofbeats approaching from behind. But don't panic. The state park allows equestrian access to some trails. If you wish to make your own horseback ride through Sleepy Hollow, there is horse trailer parking at the park's main entrance on Route 117. Not far from the village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose. And the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that while a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in the grove of the walnut trees that shades on one side of the valley. I had wandered into the noontime. With all nature peculiarly quiet, I was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world or its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of the troubled life, I know none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants of the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. That was a passage from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Happy November, and thank you again for joining me for another episode of the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I would like to thank History.com for the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman information. Visit sleepyhollow.com and Virtual Getaway on the YouTube page, which I would recommend to subscribe to. I will put all the links into the description of the video as well, as they all helped and inspired this video. I hope you had a great time, and thank you again for listening and checking out my podcast. It means the world to me, and I love you all. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe and share with a friend if you did enjoy this, and leave me a comment if you would like to hear me cover something on the next future episodes. Once again, I am Ryan Mckern. Enjoy your evening, whether it be Sleepy Hollow, New York, New Orleans, Louisiana, East Coast, West Coast, South, Midwest, wherever your dreams may lie. And until we meet again, au revoir.